Hi there, and welcome to the podcast Life as a show intently focused on exploring and unearthing the details of professions and the people behind them. I'm your host, Christopher Schoenwald. Before we begin today, I do have a content warning. Some of the topic matter is of a graphic and mature nature. It may not be suitable or appropriate for younger listeners or those sensitive to issues relating to sexual aggression. With that in mind, please be advised. Now back to the show. In appreciating all the beauty our world holds, whether that be in reference to the physical or spiritual bonds between people, there's an underlying and almost unspoken element to all of this, which is also very much present. I'm referring to a certain darkness that does lurk on all fringes of cultures and societies around the world. Acknowledging the light also means embracing the dark. My guest today does just that. She has spent years of academic research and study on a topic that, as hard as it may seem to address, listen to, or discuss, is very much an issue that needs clear and continued attention. Dr. Leigh Harkins is an associate professor at Ontario Tech University in Canada. With a PhD in forensic psychology, her current research interests focus on understanding sexual aggression and aggression in groups, including factors influencing perceptions of the acceptability of sexually coercive behavior, technology, sexual violence, and multiple perpetrator sexual offending. Her work has focused on understanding and improving assessment and treatment of sexual offenders. This combined work has highlighted the importance of accurate and evidence-based approaches to assessment and treatment. She also has practice experience working in treatment groups for sexual offenders and completing psychological assessments in prisons and community criminal justice settings in Canada and the UK. Dr. Harkins has published numerous manuscripts in peer-reviewed journals and book chapters and has co-edited a book in the area of forensic psychology and has presented her research at international conferences. She has supervised honors thesis in Masters of Arts, Masters of Science, Forensic Psychology, Doctorate, and PhD students in Forensic Psychology. Aside from her professional endeavors, she is an avid traveler, having explored and traversed most countries around the world. Outside of her work and global escapades, you can find Dr. Harkins cooking up delicious vegan dishes or cycling around Toronto. Not to be left out is her passion towards all things canine. She and her rescue dog, Sadie, are often out together, socializing with friends and exploring the world. Dr. Harkins, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks. Happy to be here.
Yeah, really excited to get into this with you today. But before we do get going, how would you like to be addressed? Shall we keep the formalities or would you like to go with your first name of Leigh?
Yeah, no, I'm good with Leigh. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Well, let's get right into it. Our first segment, Leigh, is something called Coloring Wikipedia. And as my listeners might know, basically it's a segment where I read off a description from Wikipedia of the profession. And there's a couple of reasons why we do this. One, of course, is just to enlighten listeners to the basic roles and responsibilities related to a profession. But secondly, and I think more importantly, is it offers kind of a jumping off point for us to kind of highlight the points that are not included in the definition, the intricacies or the hidden intricacies of the job, if you will. So for you, I've got you down for two things, actually. Of course, professor, and I'm also going to read off something for forensic psychology. So here we go with professor, first off. A professor is an accomplished and recognized academic. Professors often conduct original research and commonly teach undergraduate, professional, or postgraduate courses in their fields of expertise. In universities with graduate schools, professors may mentor and supervise graduate students conducting research for a thesis or dissertation. All right, forensic psychology. Forensic psychology is a subfield of psychology, involves the application of psychological knowledge and methods to both civil and criminal legal questions. Now, I know both definitions are quite broad and also a little bit vague too, but I'd be curious how you kind of marry them together in terms of your role as one, just being a professor, but then also how that relates to your field of forensic psychology.
Yes. So the forensic psychology piece, I do have experience working, a little bit of work in that, like actually in practice. So I've, worked in the treatment groups and I've done some assessments. So I think that really informs a lot of the academic work that I do. I think the description of professor sums up pretty well the kind of stuff that we're doing on a day-to-day. Roughly about 40% of our work is meant to be research, about 40% is supposed to be teaching. The rest is sort of committees and different sort of service work. So a large part of what we're doing is teaching, and then research alongside that. And so the teaching, I guess, is where, and the research is where we bring in the forensic psychology. So I teach a course on sexual offending. I teach a forensic assessment course. I teach an abnormal psych course just about understanding mental health. So our entire degree program is actually a forensic psychology program, which is quite rare. So it's nice that in that role, I'm able to really narrow in on the areas of forensic psychology that I have expertise in. Not a lot of programs allow you to do that. So yeah, it's just about any application of psychology to the law or criminal justice. And so those are my kind of little angles, the way I go about kind of teaching those topics or how we address it.
Okay. As far as say the research goes, of course, publications and such, I would assume as well you have like the qualitative side where you're out in the field and you're speaking to people directly. To what degree is that involved?
Yeah, so that's definitely a component. So I've got experience doing both qualitative and quantitative research. So some of it has been interviewing people who've committed offenses. Some of it has been interviewing people, students related to their kind of experiences with sexual violence. So yeah, that's definitely a big part of it. I mean, the majority of my research has been quantitative, but I've done some research looking at the role of denial in treatment. So what do we do with people who are in denial in treatment programs? And so that involved some interviews with people. So there's definitely both pieces there. And just also to, I guess, go back to the definition about the graduate kind of component, a lot of our research actually happens with and via students. So either undergraduate thesis students or with master's and graduate, PhD students. So that's sort of a really important way, I think, that the two of those kind of come together, the research and the teaching piece. So I'm the director of our graduate program, forensic psychology graduate program. So, I supervise quite a lot of students, and so they're all doing really diverse and interesting topics that's one of my favorite parts of the job, is that I get to have kind of input into all these different project areas that these students are working in and are passionate about.
Yeah, I suppose it would expose you to a lot of different perspectives and ways of thinking and tackling, some of these issues related to your specialty.
Yeah, and I'm always amazed when they come with these ideas for things that I've never thought of, that nobody else is doing. Even when they're really, early in their education, it's I don't know, it's really inspiring. It's nice to see these like excited young minds.
Right. Yeah, no doubt. No doubt. One other quick question relating to all of this, and this might be a sliver of what you do, but I'd still be curious to explore it. Again, in light of what you're doing and what you're studying, to what degree are you having people outside you coming to you and asking for advice, whether that be, say, law enforcement agencies or otherwise?
I don't do a lot of that myself. Every now and then we are contacted by media, but I definitely have colleagues within our program who work very closely with law enforcement. So they tend to have expertise related to expert witnesses or, police interrogations, improving kind of interrogation techniques. So I've been consulted on some cases in the past related to some of the denial work that I did. But that's going back a little ways. So the majority of what I'm doing now is teaching and research.
Okay, well, excellent. No, I think that it paints a nice picture for people to get a good overview of what you are doing and how it relates to your field of expertise. So
Yeah.
I would like to meander over into our next segment, something called a Q&A discovery. So I'm going to fire off a few questions for you. And this first one here, Leigh, it goes without saying, your field of study is quite heavy, between the graphic nature of it all, and also the significance it plays in matters of public safety, policy, and reform programs. I think it'd be fascinating to hear what led you into this field of forensic psychology. How did you end up here?
Yeah, it was sort of a fumbling my way into it, I think more than anything. I was doing forensic science actually as my undergrad degree, and we had to take a social science course, and so I took psych and ended up really loving it. And at the time I really didn't think I'd probably go to grad school. Like that wasn't something that was on my radar. I certainly wasn't planning, a PhD back in my undergrad. And so when I started taking these psychology courses, the idea of doing something psych related instead of the kind of more science lab based forensic work was really appealing to me. The idea that it would be a lot more dynamic, that if I were to go the forensic science route, I started to kind of expect that I'd be analyzing blood or semen samples all day. that it would be pretty pretty standard sort of work. Whereas people are unique, and each person, even if they're presenting with the same kind of issues, um, are all coming from very different places and have very different kind of needs and characteristics. And so that was really appealing to me, that move towards the forensic psychology side of things. And then as part of that, as part of my undergrad, I did a placement with Center for Addiction and Mental Health with a forensic psychiatrist. And so I was sitting in on assessments with him. He asked if I wanted to start sitting in on the treatment group for sexual offending that he was running. And so I started just sitting in and kind of semi co-facilitating those, although I more just listened and sort of took it all in. And there was a PhD student who was also working in that group who asked if I wanted to start just doing some volunteer work for him. And that was looking at a number of different risk assessments for people who committed sex offenses. So I ended up starting to work with him, and he really mentored me through applying to my master's, through applying to my PhD. Really, it was through that kind of experience, and just as each of those experiences sort of, or opportunities, I guess, presented themselves, I just sort of went with it. So the experience was related to working with sexual violence, and I found it fascinating. So whereas other people might have been, had the experience and gone off in a different direction, I found I just was fascinated by it and just sort of stuck with it.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Generally, I think maybe there's a perception here where people have like this idea of, okay, this is what I want to do in terms of, say, of a career, and they have like this bullseye, this target, and they go straight for it. But I'd imagine, I mean, statistically, I have no idea what these numbers might be, but I'd imagine probably most people go about it the way you did. You start off in one spot, you learn something new, and then you go over to this spot, and it just sort of like naturally evolves. And then here you are, you end up in wherever profession that you're currently within. So yeah, it sounds like that could have been the case for you.
It was. I mean, I think there was a time when I started to think I was interested in clinical psychology. I applied to a bunch of clinical psychology programs, didn't get into any of them. And then I ended up doing my master's in counseling, and I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the working with people piece, but I didn't think I was especially great at it. Like it didn't feel like it came naturally to me. Whereas the research side of things and the teaching, I think, just felt like a better fit as those opportunities kind of presented themselves.
Okay. Well, thank you for sharing that. I do have another question here. In terms of, I guess, diving in a little bit, and attaining a basic synopsis of some of your findings related to, say, our current understanding of sexual aggression. I mean, at least for me, just scanning the news each and every day, I feel as though there's always something popping up related to that. And I don't know whether that's an attention bias issue for myself, or if it's just, indicating the prevalence of these issues within society. So perhaps you could comment to that.
I think these are things that are being called out a lot more frequently than they used to be. And I think they're coming to our attention a lot more than they used to. So I do think we are seeing it more often, where people are being held accountable for their kind of inappropriate, sexual violence, their behaviors. So I think we are seeing a lot more of it because of that. So yeah, I would say that there's just a lot more of it being brought to our attention.
A lot more of awareness, right, on both sides, perhaps. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Also, too, I understand that you studied the role of, say, technology, as far as what role it plays in, affecting the acceptability of sexually coercive behavior. In terms of that, maybe you could fill listeners in a little bit about that aspect.
Yeah, so one of the things that I've looked at with one of my students, one of my master's students who's recently graduated, and she's doing her PhD elsewhere. We've looked at technology and sexual violence in a number of different ways. So one of the things we were looking at was the relationship between dating app use and people's experiences with sexual violence. And so how often was it happening that people were meeting up with someone that they'd met on an app, and then were being kind of forced to do things they didn't want to do, or they were finding themselves feeling unsafe. And I've actually got a student who's looking at that a little bit more now, looking to see whether people's precautions have changed during COVID. So are they more or less willing to meet people that they've met online than they would have been otherwise? Are they,
That's fascinating.
So we're still looking at some of that stuff. And I mean, with the dating, it's still unclear whether this is a new way that people are just perpetrating these offenses, or whether this is a new group of people who are seeing this opportunity. So we're still sort of looking at some of that. We've also, my student has mainly looked at unsolicited sexual images. And so looking to see how often people are sending images. We more commonly hear about it, we think about it in terms of men sending images to women, but we did find that male and females are both sending images back and forth to each other, sometimes without the other person's consent. She found, I think, in her sample, about 1 in 10 people were sending unsolicited sexual images.
Wow.
Commonly, that was to someone that they may be in a relationship with, or they at least had some sort of prior interaction with. And the main motivation for most of the people isn't nefarious. They're sort of doing it in a sort of transactional mindset, that they're trying to just get images back. But others are doing it for shock. And one of the things that she looked at, and I think we probably need to look at in a bit more depth, is how sending unsolicited images might relate to something like exhibitionism. So somebody who might expose themselves in person, are there overlaps between those individuals and the people who are sending an image to somebody unexpectedly. So she didn't find a direct link between those two in her work, but I do think it's something that needs to be explored a bit further. So those are a few of the ways that we're looking at technology. I mean, also things around, sometimes it's called revenge porn, but it's basically kind of image-based sexual abuse, where somebody might non-consensually share an image that somebody consensually sent to them. So say you're interacting with somebody that you're in a relationship with, and they then post that image or share that image beyond that, and just how harmful that can be, and what some of the reasons are that people do that. So that's the main sort of technology related kind of components, I guess, that we've looked at lately.
Yeah, I think, again, I've seen just different articles over the years, or maybe studies perhaps relating to, pornography perhaps being affecting youth and their perceptions of reality and what's acceptable and what's not. In terms of some of these these discussions on technology, I'd be curious of whether or not you've encountered any roadblocks as far as trying to, find solutions to these things, or presenting potential ways of navigating these points, things such as net neutrality arguments coming up, and
It's not something that we've dealt with directly, but I do think that it is directly relevant to a lot of the image-based content that ends up out there. I think the idea that we need to allow equal access to all of this material, I understand it to an extent, but I also think that there's some illegal, very harmful things that are allowed to kind of go on. And it's such, I was reading something recently that people who are trying to track sort of child abuse images and monitor that sort of thing, they're just so overwhelmed that they just can't keep up. It's just so prevalent. And and they are starting to do things like trying to bring in AI to look at things like scouring for child abuse images. So if they can get something automated that's out there scouring for those kind of things, it frees up manpower to kind of investigate and pursue some of the people who are creating or sharing or distributing these types of images of kids.
Yeah. Quite frankly, it blows my mind that these arguments have any standing, and that there's swaths of people that get behind them like, no, you're not going to infringe upon my digital rights to do all of these awful and terrible things.
No,
It's a shocking aspect of, our culture and society,
it
quite
is.
frankly, at least in my opinion. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
agreed.
Okay. Well, I do want to move on to another question here, and this one's a bit more on a personal side here. And of course, I do want to qualify this with, acknowledging that you, as a professional, with your knowledge, authority in your area of expertise, coupled with professionalism and, of course, your academic prowess, I'd be fascinated to know some of your coping mechanisms you use to kind of, one, maybe decompress, or two, even like decouple yourself from your work.
Yeah, like hard drugs. No, no, no. Um, I spend a lot of time with dogs. Like I find that it's
That one
just
got me. Sorry. That was good.
um, I spend a lot of time just out walking, and I think just getting outside, and like if I've had a really rough day, getting out and walking my dog for an hour and seeing all the other dogs and watching them play, there's just so much joy in them, and just unconditional love. And I think spending time around, yeah, just being outside and spending time around dogs just really kind of helps. So that's kind of one thing that on a regular, on a daily, multiple times a day kind of basis, I
Mm,
think helps me disconnect and just get away from this material a little bit.
mhm. Yeah.
Uh, so
Do
yeah.
I have no idea, but I mean, on this program at least, I've had a guest, a mental health advocate on, so we've
Mm,
we've spoken to issues relating to that. I'd be curious, with, at Ontario Tech, the university that you're working at, and specifically within your program, are there programs that are actively put in front of, say, some of the workers, or like, professors there, that like, we understand that this is a heavy subject matter, that if you ever do need to speak to somebody about that for yourself, your own mental health,
yeah.
these options are available.
There are options available to us. It's not something that is, I mean, there's a lot more advocacy on behalf of the students, I think, like ensuring the students know that there's support out there. I mean, we're covered for support, but it isn't
Right.
something, I don't think, that that really gets probably that much attention. It's something that we're sort of left to figure out a little bit. I mean, not that I think they aren't concerned about it, but it's more just that
It hasn't
I
reached
think
that
no,
point.
and I think a lot of the systems. I mean, and I appreciate that, like, the priority is making sure that services are available to students and that they have easy access to support and that we all know where the support is for them. Um, so yeah, that's
Mm,
we're covered for it if we choose to pursue
right.
it. But
But
it
it's
is,
not put in front of you. Like, I just had a vision in my head where, like, within the field of, say, your expertise, that there would be a component where it's like, yes, we understand that this is going to be heavy, and there's going to be moments where it might hit you in a strange way, that, this is important to acknowledge, that it's probably normal and it's natural, and here you go if you need it. But it sounds like
yeah.
it's more of just, it's on the outside there. Yeah, we do have it technically, but it's not at the
So I
forefront.
will say, if you're someone who's working in practice, so if you're working as a clinician, there is a lot more support available. So they would need to have kind of ongoing supervision, peer support, peer supervision, where they'd be kind of checking in with somebody on a regular basis. But they've got so it's a lot more. There are definitely more concrete systems in place if
Mm,
you're somebody who's day to day working with individuals who've kind of in a forensic psychology kind of
mm,
setting. And it's definitely something I have to be mindful of, just even as a professor who's supervising students working in this area. So I had a student who was reading through chat logs on a website that is basically a pro pedophilia website. So, and that is incredibly traumatic. These are people with very concerning kind of beliefs and who feel very strongly about them. And so she's kind of having to read through all of these things. And so it is something that I was mindful about, kind of checking in with her about, reminding her to take breaks, reminding her that this is, that trying to ensure that I'm kind of reminding myself to make sure she's okay. Because it's
yeah, yeah.
hard enough to be doing. You know, a lot of what we do is on, you know, on a higher level where you're just using the term sexual violence, but when you start getting into the nitty gritty of people's kind of descriptions of their fantasies or descriptions of, you know, experiences that they've had, it's really, really kind of disturbing, upsetting.
I've got a follow-up question kind of related to what you're just speaking out right now. For example, when news breaks of you know, a high-profile sexual predator, you know, what is your first reaction? Is it measured or is it visceral? I mean, how do you react to those
Um,
types of things?
I think at first it's visceral, and then I think it's almost like a, okay, I mean, it's I'm glad when people have been stopped from harming people. um you know, it's sort of a, I hope they get some support that they need. I hope that they end up in treatment. And I mean, not in the not too distant past, it came to kind of attention in our field that somebody who worked in our field had allegations brought against him.
Wow.
And that was a tough one. That, I mean, it's always hard to hear, but that was especially tough to hear because this is somebody who really understands the extent of harm that's caused when people commit these types of offenses, and to kind of have that knowledge and then still go out and kind of engage in these types of crimes was, it was, that one was hard to get my head around. I mean,
Mm.
it's always hard to know that these things are happening, but
Especially
especially when
disheartening.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So I mean, I think that's I'm not often surprised when I hear about some of these things coming forward, and I do have to say it is. I'm glad we are starting to hear more about it, because to me that means people are being held accountable and people aren't just accepting some of the things that we've accepted for years and years. And the more that we're challenging people in some of these problematic kind of attitudes, behaviors, um, the hope is that people will be learning from this and learning that it's not okay, and that you know, we'll start seeing less and less of it,
Mhm.
ideally.
Yeah, well, I think you just answered my next question, which was basically, are there some areas within society that we are doing, you know, a reasonably good job at handling issues relating to assessment and treatment of sexual offenders? And I guess one of those sides is just like the awareness issues of it. But perhaps there's a few other areas as well.
Yeah, I think within forensic psychology, and especially within the area of sexual violence, I think assessment and treatment are two things that um, we're good at. I mean, I think not, we are good at it. I mean, I think with the assessment especially, I think it's an area that is very heavily researched. I think you know, the assessment measures, the risk assessment measures that are used are constantly being evaluated and fine-tuned, and I think we have a pretty good sense of the kinds of factors that at least predict reoffending.
Mm.
So we can see, you know, who do we need to be more concerned about, who do we need to kind of monitor more closely, who do we maybe need to keep incarcerated for a little bit longer than anybody else. So from the assessment side of things, I think we're quite good at it. Treatment, we're getting there. Treatment, I think, is tougher. You know, it's hard to do research on treatment because it's usually small groups, and there are some like bigger kind of prospective studies where they look at, you know, treatment and starting early and then look way down the road. But it's really hard research to do because, you know, when you look at something like depression, you can offer a treatment program and then you can ask somebody at the end whether they feel better. But if you want to look at the outcomes of sex offender treatment, you're offering the treatment, and then you often have to wait 2, 5, 10 years down the road to see whether there are reductions in reoffending. And so it's quite, and then if you find out at that point that the treatment wasn't effective, well, then you're kind of back to starting over. So
Right.
the treatment side of things is tougher. It's sort of an evolving process. And I think we adjust the different things that are addressed in treatment. You know, over time, we see that certain things that we think are really important to focus on in treatment, like trying to build empathy, don't necessarily seem to be related to outcomes. So,
Mhm.
you know, we may want to shift a little bit in terms of the things that are addressed. One of the things that really consistently comes out in much of the research that I've done and much of the research that's out there is how important the role of, you know, rape supportive cognitions or like victim blaming kind of attitudes. Having those kinds of attitudes are, you know, quite predictive of future offending. And so I think, you know, remove treatment in a way that we're, you know, just narrowing down, we've always kind of looked at cognitions, but, narrowing down what it is that is effective to work on treatment. There's, fine tuning some of the ways that, trauma, using kind of trauma-informed treatment, because many of the people who commit these offenses have their own traumatic histories that kind of impact their ability to benefit from treatment. There are different approaches to treatment that are more likely to get the individuals on board. So things that look more future focused, that are about kind of helping them have a life that isn't compatible with offending. So what kind of things were you trying to achieve with offending? And, how do we go about helping you get those things in a way that doesn't harm anybody else? So that's, a model called the Good Lives model, which I really like, because you can still address a lot of the same things, but do so in a way that you're more likely to get buy-in from the individuals. They're more likely to actually get on board when this is about moving forward, and not just about listing all the things that they'll never be able to do in the future.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah, so it's little things like that where we're kind of tweaking treatment and evaluating it and looking to see whether these things work, and just
Yeah, I
keeping
mean,
it.
it would seem like it's a bit of a black box in that sense, where maybe it's not a one size fits all sort of application to each individual, and that's got to be one, quite frustrating to work with and trying to sort through this. And then also too, it was really enlightening to hear that other side of it when you are tweaking and trying to change, but that it is a long tail sort of scenario where you have to wait those 5-10 years more or less to see how it plays out. And yeah, it certainly makes sense when you're hearing it for the first time like I am right now, or other listeners, but also too, it kind of just really drives home the point of this being quite the challenge in trying to work these things through. And sometimes I think within the media, people are quick to jump on policies and reforms that are coming out, and if they're not working out, if you do have an offender who does go through a program and then is released and then reoffends, of course it's easy to jump on that. But in behind the scenes, all of these different programs and ways of in which people like yourself are trying to find these solutions, it is not easy. It is not easy to do, and it takes time.
Yeah, and I think, you mentioned like people having all these different individualized needs. So, most would probably benefit from some sort of individualized component, but there's also the resource issue. So oftentimes they're treated in groups, and there is some room for kind of individualized approaches within a group setting. And there are lots of benefits as well to having people in groups, the way they can kind of challenge each other, the way they can learn how to there are interpersonal benefits for them learning how to interact with other people in a healthier way. But many would benefit from much more individualized work, and often there are resource implications that just won't allow that. And the public plays a big role in this. I mean, there's not always a lot of support towards putting more money towards people who've committed offenses. And there's always the argument, why are we paying for treatment for somebody who's committed these offenses, but we're not maybe paying for treatment for the victims, for example? And I think that's fair. I would like to see both getting and getting whatever care they need. The one thing I will say is, by investing resources into treatment of the people who committed the offenses, you are protecting, you're improving public safety, you're preventing future victims. So I always think that it's, prevention is always a really worthy, expenditure, I think.
Yeah.
If you're going to help people down the road. Yeah.
No doubt. Well, thanks for sharing that, Leigh. I do want to move over into another segment, something called a water cooler story. And basically here, I just asked the guests to indulge listeners with a story related to their profession. So I'd love to hear what you've got.
Yeah. So one that came to mind was something that really shaped how I kind of approached. So when I originally thought that I was going to be going into more clinical type work, I had a couple sort of little epiphanies throughout that process. So one was that I was working in a treatment group, and one of the things we did in the group each week was we would each go around and do a check-in. So we would, say how our week had been. And one of the things that I thought was really valuable about that was not that I didn't think these individuals were humans, but it was also, as a student coming into this, it was hard to see the person past the offense. You really kind of, when you're new to this, it's really hard to not just think this is so-and-so who did this awful thing. And so I found the check-ins really helped to, make me care about these individuals as people. I cared about how their job interview went. I cared about, how their relationship was developing with their son that they've recently reconnected with. And one of the things we would sort of check into, and one of the things that I mentioned was that I had joined a new gym, and someone in the group just conversationally, oh, which gym? And I'd said which one it was. And the next time I was at that gym, I saw this person at the gym, and this is somebody who'd committed an offense against an adult woman. And it just, the reality of that, finding that balance between having those human interactions, but also personal safety, was a huge eye opener for me, that I still wanted to have those human connections with the people I might be working with, but also just that I had to also, I couldn't just toss the offense aside.
Right,
that
right.
had to be something that sort of played in the background as well. And just finding a way to kind of combine those into
Marry
a
them
complex
together in a way that
package. Yeah. So that was one that I think is related to the forensic psych work. And then I think the professor or the academic side, I would just say that one of the things that's been really rewarding for me has been watching the development of students that I supervise through PhDs. So my first PhD student has since had his own PhD students, and I met him at a conference once and told him he was my academic grandchild. And so he has since done really well and has been really successful. He examined one of my PhD students recently, and I think watching that development and these people that you've had some part in, helping develop and watching them be so successful and move off and do these exciting things in their own right, I think is a really rewarding part of this job. And I think one of the reasons that I think I value it so much is being able to see that development and the exciting things that the people kind of move on and do.
Yeah, I could see that definitely being a rewarding aspect. I mean, I think that goes across or cuts across most industries when you are sort of mentoring somebody along and helping them and seeing them develop and what they can accomplish. But then also too, it's almost like doubly rewarding, I would guess, in your line of work, because the types of, again, subject matter that you're researching, ultimately the aims are at helping society function more smoothly, more safely. And, somebody like this, perhaps their future research and the programs that they're working on do have impacts on large swaths of the population, and that definitely has got to feel
Yeah,
rewarding. So
yeah.
can
So
appreciate that.
those are the good parts.
All right. Well, thank you for sharing that. Both those stories were really interesting and enlightening. We are going to move over into our last segment, and this is called a crystal ball segment. And as it implies, I mean, we're looking towards the future. Typically, we're looking at trends within the industry, predictions, so on and so forth. But as far as looking at the field of forensic psychology moving forward, what areas do you project opportunities for potential breakthroughs, as relating to our understanding of sexual aggression, assessment, or treatment?
So I definitely think this technology piece, there's a lot more going to come with that. I think with improved access to technology, within different types of technology available to us, I think there are an equal number of opportunities to abuse those. And so I think just being on top of all of those different avenues and where there's potential for abuse and harm to come about, I think is really important. In terms of assessment, there's some interesting stuff, within the last few years, people have started to do some stuff looking at like virtual reality for doing assessments and things like eye tracking. So looking to see, when you're doing an assessment of somebody's sexual interest, for example, if you're putting them into kind of a VR setting, where is it that their attention is directed? If you're doing eye tracking and you're showing them images of kids and adults, where is their attention directed? And can those things be used to tell us about somebody's sexual interests and
Wow.
whether somebody's interests are more or less problematic? So I think those are some interesting, directions in terms of definitely sort of a technology focus. I also think there's increasingly work going on around just how we understand deviant sexual interest. So maybe, primarily sexual interest in children. And there's a lot of interesting work out there on people putting forward proposals that it's basically sort of an additional type of sexual orientation. So, that some people the majority of people are adult oriented, but there's a small minority of people whose primary sexual interest is in children. That's not in any way to excuse it or make it okay that somebody might harm children, but just that an acknowledgement that there's something with those individuals, that this is what their primary interest is. And there's a lot of work starting to happen around people who identify as they call themselves minor attracted persons. So these are individuals who acknowledge that they have a sexual interest in children, and many of them don't want to act on them. So it's a really complicated area because a lot of psychological professions have a duty to report. So if they think that somebody's at risk of harming a child, they have a responsibility to pass that on. But if these are individuals who haven't harmed anybody and who are trying to seek help so that they don't harm anybody, reporting them doesn't actually do anybody any help. So there's a lot of interesting research starting to happen. I have a PhD student who's doing work in this area on, how do we ensure that people who acknowledge that they have sexual interest in kids get help so that they don't ever hurt a child. And many of them don't want to. They're recognizing how harmful that is and how problematic it is, and they want support for it. And so, there are some pilot projects out there where people are offering kind of treatment and support lines. There's a big project going on in Germany that's quite a few years been going on now, called Project Dunkelfeld, which is about trying to identify those people with those interests through, they were putting posters on buses and subways, saying, do you have a kind of an unnatural interest in kids? We can help. And so looking to see whether they can reach people before, so again, that prevention kind of piece, looking to see whether we can reach people with, concerning kind of sexual interests and intervene before they get to a point where they might actually harm someone.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that kind of answers one of the questions, the follow-up questions I had. I mean, reasons for optimism within this field of study. And, when you let off with that point of people identifying, of their interests relating to children, yeah, you probably noticed my eyes kind of like opening a little bit more widely for that. But then as you went on and explained this a little bit further, you can see the reasoning behind it. I think it's that shock value, at least initially, that gets people like knocked off their spot. But then once it is explained in the way or the manner that you just did, you can see the reasoning behind it and what options do present themselves once you kind of take yourself down some of these paths. And I think that what you just said illustrates that perfectly.
Yeah, and I do think I think prevention is just the best we can do to try to move forward in this field. Is how do we stop these things before they're happening? And I think this is a very good example of one way that we can try to do that. So I think that's quite promising. And there's a lot of stuff going on around some of my students are doing some work on campus sexual violence and how do we reach students early on to get them to kind of challenge some of those problematic beliefs and ideas and victim blaming kind of mindsets. And so I think however we can kind of come at that prevention piece, and we're getting better at it. I think we're moving in that direction. There's always kind of prevention work going on. So I think that's where that's really promising work that is important.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And as well, how you mentioned about VR as well, technology being incorporated into it. That's kind of really quite fascinating to explore as well. I wish we had more time to kind of get into that. I'm sure there's a lot of other fields relating to technology, whether it's big data, AI algorithms, so on and so forth. That is probably being applied within your field, but perhaps that could be a discussion for another day. Yeah. But I mean, we are drawing to a close here, Leigh, and I am quite conscious of your time, and I do thank you for it. It's been a really informative conversation. I've really enjoyed, speaking with you and listening to all that you've shared. So thank you very much for coming on today.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. Now, for those interested in learning more about Leigh and her work, you can find her on LinkedIn. And also, too, if you like today's episode, please be sure to tell a friend. Share, 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 share. I think, of course, one, it helps the show grow. But then, secondly, too, there's enough divide out there right now. And the better we can understand one another, what we're doing, what we're dealing with in terms of stresses, pressures, but also moments of satisfaction, it's going to bring us together. And hey, that's never a bad thing. Also, too, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you access your podcasts. That stuff does count and it does help. Also, too, you can also tell a friend about the program. We're on Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and most recently, we just launched a YouTube channel. So you can actually watch these conversations that we're having. And of course, don't forget to join us on the next episode of Life as where we'll continue to explore and unearth the details of professions and the people behind them. I'm your host, Christopher Schoenwald. And until next time, stay curious about life and living.